The hydraulic rams bite into the riverbed at 19 meters below the surface, churning sediment that has not seen daylight since Ulysses S. Grant commanded the Union siege of Vicksburg. The Mississippi current runs at 4 knots here, pushing against the stabilization anchors of the twin crane barges, each displacing 800 tons of reinforced steel and diesel-powered winching systems. Sound of hydraulic pressure release, deep mechanical groaning. The dive team has been working in zero visibility for 6 hours, their hands reading the contours of what ground-penetrating radar identified 3 weeks ago as an anomaly in the sediment profile, something too symmetrical to be natural debris, too massive to be another Civil War gunboat wreck. The sonar technician aboard the command barge watches his screen with the intensity of a man who knows that every ping costs $12,000 in equipment deployment. Then the display freezes. The acoustic signature changes. What they are seeing is not possible according to any database of known river artifacts. Sound of sonar pinging, water displacement. The dive team leader surfaces, ripping his mask away, shouting over the diesel roar of the pumps that the paddle wheel assembly is still intact, but the metal does not corrode like iron, does not feel like bronze, and when his cutting torch made contact for sample extraction, the sparks burned white gold instead of orange-red. The project engineer, a woman who has supervised 17 major salvage operations across the inland waterway system, goes silent for 11 seconds before ordering the deployment of the heavy-lift slings. The numbers do not align with historical records. No steamship manufactured between 1860 and 1865 used precious metal alloys for structural components. The cost would have been prohibitive. The strategic value would have been catastrophic. Yet the density readings coming back from the magnetometer array suggest that what lies beneath 20 meters of compacted silt and clay is not just gold-plated, but constructed from solid high-carat alloy. A ship built not to sail but to store. Not to transport cargo, but to become cargo itself, if certain conditions were met. 4 seconds of absolute silence, wind over water, distant crow call. The crane operators engage the main winch at dawn when the current runs weakest, feeding 12-millimeter braided steel cable through pulleys the size of truck tires. The lift will require precise calculation of buoyancy displacement, because the sediment has created a suction seal around the hull. A mudlock that can generate forces exceeding 600 metric tons of resistance. The chief hydraulic engineer orders the activation of the water jet array, 16 high-pressure nozzles that will blast channels beneath the wreck to break the vacuum effect. Sound of water jets activating, pressurized roar building. The brown river water turns darker as centuries of settled sediment billow to the surface, creating a plume visible from the Vicksburg Bluffs 3 kilometers downstream. Spectators have been gathering since word leaked through the salvage community that something unprecedented was emerging from the river. Local historians arrive with period photographs. Maritime archaeologists from Tulane and the Smithsonian set up documentation stations on the shore. A NOAA observer monitors for environmental compliance because the Mississippi remains a federally managed navigation channel despite its role as a cemetery for American industrial ambition. The first section to break the surface is not the prow, but a segment of the starboard paddle wheel housing, and the gasps from the observation teams are audible even over the machinery, because the metal gleams with an intensity that mud and darkness and 160 years of submersion should have destroyed. Gold does not tarnish. Gold does not oxidize. Gold waits with the patience of geological time for someone to remember why it was hidden. Sound of metal emerging from water, mud sliding off surfaces. The salvage director makes the call to halt operations for photographic documentation because what they are raising is no longer a recovery project, but an archaeological event that will rewrite the narrative of Confederate finance and the desperate mathematics of a collapsing economy that knew it was collapsing. The ship they are touching belonged to the Southern banking elite, specifically to a consortium of 7 cotton factors and Mississippi River shipping magnates who understood by April of 1863 that the Union blockade would strangle New Orleans, that Vicksburg would fall, and that Confederate currency would become worthless paper within 18 months. They needed a vault that could move. They needed a vault that could sink. They needed a vault that could wait. The vessel was commissioned under the name Aurelia, a word chosen for its Latin root meaning golden one, registered officially as a paddle wheel packet steamer, designed for cotton and mail transport between Natchez and Memphis. The construction records, discovered in a Baton Rouge archive by a graduate student writing a thesis on wartime logistics, show something irregular in the material procurement. The ship's keel was laid in November 1861 at a private shipyard in Algiers, Louisiana, using timber from cypress swamps and iron fittings from a foundry in Selma, Alabama. But the paddle wheel assemblies were manufactured separately in New Orleans by a German immigrant metalworker named Klaus Hoffmann, who had arrived from Bavaria in 1849, with experience in precision casting and access to a network of European bullion traders. The invoices list the paddle wheels as reinforced iron, but the weight specifications are wrong by a factor of 3. Iron paddle wheels for a ship of Aurelia's dimensions should have weighed approximately 1,400 kilograms per assembly. The manifests show 3,800 kilograms. Sound of archival papers rustling, pen scratching on ledger. The discrepancy was buried in bureaucratic confusion, in the chaos of a government trying to build a navy and an army simultaneously, while the economy evaporated beneath both. The true purpose of the Aurelia was never documented in Confederate naval records because it was not a naval vessel. It belonged to the shadow system of private finance that kept the plantation economy alive, even as Union forces cut the South into disconnected territories. The ship made only 4 documented voyages between February and May of 1863, each time departing from a different river port at night, without manifest declarations. Witnesses later testified in depositions taken during Reconstruction that the ship sat low in the water, that it moved slowly despite having functional steam engines, and that armed guards prevented anyone from approaching the cargo decks. One deckhand who worked the April voyage described seeing wooden crates marked with the seal of the Citizens Bank of Louisiana, each crate requiring 4 men to load, and each crate producing a metallic sliding sound when tilted. He assumed it was gold coin or bullion being moved upriver away from the advancing Union Army. He was partially correct. The crates contained the disassembled components of the ship's own infrastructure, gold plates and fittings that could be bolted into place when the vessel reached its final hiding location. The Aurelia was being transformed from ship to bank vault during its final voyage, a process of metamorphosis that required it to travel into the narrowest channels of the Yazoo River Delta, where Union gunboats could not follow. Sound of steam whistle, distant and mournful, echo over water. The ship vanished from historical record on May 19, 1863, the same day that General Grant's forces completed their encirclement of Vicksburg. Confederate observers on the bluffs watched the Aurelia steam north past the city under cover of morning fog, paddle wheels churning slowly against the spring current. It never reached Greenville. It never reached Memphis. For 163 years, the assumption among Civil War historians was that the ship either sank in combat or was scuttled by its crew to prevent capture. Neither theory explained why no debris field was ever located, why no insurance claim was ever filed, and why Klaus Hoffmann left New Orleans 3 days after the ship's disappearance and returned to Germany, where he purchased a brewery in Munich and lived in comfortable wealth until his death in 1891. The pieces of the puzzle existed in different archives, in different states, in different languages. No one assembled them until a salvage company running routine sonar mapping for the Army Corps of Engineers detected the anomaly and decided to investigate a shape that should not exist in a riverbed that had been surveyed dozens of times. The crane barges execute the primary lift at 1100 hours when wind conditions are optimal and the river stage is falling. The lift plan calls for a synchronized 3-point suspension system that will distribute the weight across reinforced hardpoints identified through subsurface imaging. Sound of steel cables tensioning, hydraulic systems pressurizing. The deck crews watch the tension gauges climb toward their calculated maximum load of 900 metric tons, a figure that should be impossible for a 19th century paddle wheeler. But that matches the readings if the primary structural elements are manufactured from gold alloy rather than iron or steel. Gold has a density of 19.3 grams per cubic centimeter, more than twice the density of steel, which means that a ship built from gold components would weigh exponentially more than its iron equivalent, while maintaining the same external dimensions. The engineering implications are staggering. The ship would have required reinforced hull planking to support the weight. The steam engines would have needed triple the power output to achieve navigable speed. The paddle wheels themselves would have generated catastrophic torque forces on standard iron axles. Every design choice would have been subordinated to a single purpose, creating a vessel that could be deliberately sunk in a known location and recovered later when conditions changed. But conditions did not change. The Confederacy collapsed. Vicksburg fell on July 4, 1863, after a 47-day siege that ended Southern control of the Mississippi River. The men who financed the Aurelia either died in the war, fled to Mexico and Brazil, or were economically destroyed during Reconstruction. The location of the sunken ship died with them, became rumor, became legend, became another story about Confederate gold that treasure hunters dismissed as fantasy because the mathematics seemed impossible. How do you hide 1,500 tons of gold in a river channel without anyone noticing? How do you build a ship from precious metal without the construction workers revealing the secret? How do you coordinate such a project in the middle of a losing war? The answers were simpler than the questions. You hide the ship by making it look like every other vessel that sank during the conflict. You control the workers by using German immigrants loyal to their patron and isolated by language barriers. You coordinate the project by keeping it private, by using personal wealth rather than government funds, by treating it as a commercial venture rather than a military operation. 4 seconds of absolute silence, rope creaking, water lapping against hull. The hull breaks the surface at 1300 hours, and the sunlight strikes metal that has not felt air since the Lincoln administration. The color is not the bright yellow of pure gold, but a deeper amber tone that suggests alloying with copper or silver for structural strength. Sound of water cascading off metal surfaces, mud sliding in sheets. The paddle wheel housings are the first fully visible elements. Massive drums 6 meters in diameter with spokes that curve with mathematical precision. Each paddle blade bears stamped markings in a German script that archaeologists will later identify as purity certification marks used by European assay offices, proof that the metal was imported and tested before casting. The ship is not beautiful in any conventional sense. It is functional, brutal, heavy, a machine designed by accountants rather than shipwrights. The brass fittings are minimal. The deck structures are simplified to basic platforms. Every element that did not serve the core purpose of weight and storage was eliminated from the design. This is not a ship built to impress. This is a ship built to sink and wait and survive. The stabilization phase requires 3 days of continuous work, as support divers attach flotation pontoons to the hull to prevent it from rolling or breaking apart during the full extraction. The structural integrity is better than expected. Gold does not rust. Gold does not decay. The cypress planking has rotted away in places, but the metal skeleton beneath remains sound, locked together by rivets that still hold compression despite the forces of current and sediment and time. Engineers from the salvage company confer with metallurgists from the Colorado School of Mines who have flown in to examine the alloy composition. The preliminary analysis suggests a gold content of approximately 78%, alloyed with silver and copper in ratios designed to maximize tensile strength while maintaining corrosion resistance. This is not jewelry-grade metal. This is engineered material, created by someone who understood that gold's value lies not just in its rarity, but in its chemical stability, its refusal to react with oxygen or moisture or salt. A ship made of gold can wait at the bottom of a river for centuries without significant degradation, which means that whoever ordered its construction was thinking in generational timescales, planning for a future where the Confederacy might not exist, but the metal would retain its purchasing power regardless of political outcomes. Sound of welding torches, metal on metal, sharp clangs. The recovery team discovers the cargo holds on the 5th day of operations when they cut through the sealed deck hatches using diamond wire saws. The holds are not empty. Stacked in organized rows are wooden crates, the same crates described by the deckhand in his reconstruction testimony. Each crate containing precisely cast gold ingots stamped with the mark of the Citizens Bank of Louisiana and dated between January and April of 1863. The ingots are uniform in size, each one weighing approximately 12.5 kilograms, designed to be portable by a single person but too heavy to be easily stolen. There are 317 crates visible in the first hold alone. Simple arithmetic suggests a minimum of 4,000 ingots. which at current gold prices represents a market value exceeding $1.4 billion before any historical premium is applied for Civil War-era provenance. The insurance adjusters arrive within hours. The legal teams arrive by the next morning. The federal government files a claim based on the Legal Tender Act and the principle that Confederate assets were forfeited property. The state of Mississippi files a competing claim based on riverbed jurisdiction. The descendants of the original banking consortium file a claim based on private property rights that predate the forfeiture laws. Sound of helicopter rotors, distant police sirens. The ship continues to rise, section by section, as the crane barges execute a choreographed ballet of tension and release, lifting and stabilizing, moving the mast from riverbed to barge deck in increments measured by millimeters per hour. The midship section emerges to reveal the steam engine housing, and here the design philosophy becomes even clearer. The engines are standard coreless beam designs manufactured in Pittsburgh, probably captured Union equipment repurposed for Confederate use. They were never intended to provide long-term propulsion. They were meant to move the ship one final time from New Orleans to the sinking site, after which they became irrelevant. The gold components are concentrated in the hull structure and the paddle wheel assemblies, the elements that would retain their integrity underwater while the wood and iron fittings corroded away. The ship was designed to be partially disposable, built with a timeline of abandonment already factored into the construction specifications. This is engineering as time capsule, as delayed action bank vault, as a bet against immediate survival in favor of eventual recovery. The historians begin to reconstruct the final voyage using Confederate railroad timetables, Union naval logs, and newspaper archives from river towns. The Aurelia departed New Orleans on May 14, 1863, carrying a crew of 12 and no listed passengers. It traveled upriver during daylight hours, avoiding Union patrol zones by timing its movement to coincide with Confederate cavalry raids that drew federal attention away from the river. By May 17th, it reached the mouth of the Yazoo River and turned east into the Delta Network, a maze of channels and backwaters where steam-powered vessels rarely ventured because of the risk of grounding. The ship spent 2 days in the Delta, moving slowly, searching for a specific location identified in advance by Klaus Hoffmann, who had surveyed the area months earlier using depth soundings and current measurements. The chosen site needed to be deep enough to fully submerge the vessel, but stable enough to prevent the wreck from migrating downstream during floods. It needed to be in a channel that would accumulate sediment rapidly, burying the ship beneath protective layers of mud. And it needed to be close enough to civilization to be recoverable later, but remote enough to avoid accidental discovery by fishermen or salvagers. Sound of paddle wheels moving through shallow water, cypress trees creaking. On May 19th, the crew opened the seacocks and allowed the Mississippi to flood the cargo holds. The ship settled slowly, taking nearly 40 minutes to sink because the gold density created unusual buoyancy dynamics. The crew escaped in 2 rowboats and dispersed into the countryside, paid in Confederate currency that would be worthless within months, but also in small gold coins that ensured their silence through financial security. Klaus Hoffmann recorded the coordinates using celestial navigation and landmarks, information he kept encrypted in personal journals that were discovered in Munich in 1923, but not translated until 2019, when a German-American historian recognized references to Vicksburg and began investigating. The journals described the sinking in clinical detail, noting the water temperature, the rate of descent, the final position of the paddle wheels. Hoffmann expected the ship to be recovered within 5 years, assuming either Confederate victory or a negotiated peace that would allow the banking consortium to reclaim its assets legally. He waited 16 years before accepting that the Confederacy was never coming back, and that the gold would remain where it lay until someone with different motivations went looking for it. 4 seconds of absolute silence, distant thunder, rain beginning to fall on river surface. The final section to emerge is the stern quarter where the ship's name was painted in white letters on black planking. The wood has degraded, but the mounting hardware remains. Brass letters spelling Aurelia that are immediately photographed and cataloged as the confirmation of identity. The ship is not a mystery anymore. It is a fact. It is a physical object occupying space on a barge deck in the middle of the Mississippi River, while news helicopters circle overhead and legal scholars debate ownership principles, and economists calculate the inflationary impact of introducing $1.4 billion in gold into the commodities market without warning. The salvage company CEO gives a press conference in which she carefully avoids discussing the monetary value and instead emphasizes the archaeological significance, the engineering marvel, the historical importance of preserving Confederate financial records. She does not mention that the company's insurance policy caps coverage at $100 million and that they are now responsible for guarding a cargo worth 14 times that amount using security protocols designed for industrial equipment rather than precious metal transport. The gold begins to speak through laboratory analysis. Spectrographic testing identifies trace elements that link the metal to California mines, South African deposits, and European bank reserves, suggesting that the Confederacy was drawing on a global network of bullion traders to assemble the necessary material. Isotope dating confirms that most of the gold was refined between 1859 and 1862, peak years of Southern prosperity before the war strangled trade networks. Chemical signatures in the copper alloying elements point to Tennessee smelters and Georgia foundries, creating a supply chain map that reveals how the Confederate economy continued to function even as it was being cut apart by Union armies. Each ingot contains information encoded in its molecular structure, a forensic record of where the metal was born and how it traveled and who handled it. The cargo of the Aurelia is not just wealth stored in inert form. It is evidence of a parallel economy that existed in the shadows of the official Confederate government, a network of private capital that operated according to different rules and different timelines. Sound of rain intensifying, wind pushing against tarpaulins. The barge convoy begins its movement downriver toward New Orleans, where climate-controlled storage facilities and enhanced security infrastructure can protect the cargo during the legal proceedings. The journey covers 170 kilometers and requires Coast Guard escort, because the presence of $1.4 billion in gold on a slow-moving barge constitutes a security risk classified at the federal level. Divers remain on standby in case the weight distribution becomes unstable. Tugboats flank the convoy to prevent commercial traffic from approaching. Satellite tracking monitors the position every 30 seconds. The operation has become a military exercise in everything but name, transforming a section of American River into a temporary high-security corridor for the movement of assets that should have traveled this same route in 1863 under very different circumstances. The irony is not lost on the historians aboard the escort vessels who note that the Union Navy once controlled this exact stretch of water and would have seized the Aurelia immediately if they had understood what they were looking at. The question that dominates the academic conferences and legal seminars is why the ship was built in the first place. Gold is valuable because it is portable and fungible, easy to divide and transport and exchange. Building that gold into a massive ship defeats every advantage of the material. The answer lies in the psychology of collapse, in the mental calculations of people who watched their currency depreciate by 70% in a single year, and understood that paper wealth was an illusion sustained by collective agreement to pretend the paper meant something. The banking consortium needed to convert abstract financial instruments into physical reality, needed to take the ledger entries and promissory notes and stock certificates and transform them into metal that would exist regardless of which government controlled the territory. But they also needed that metal to be too large to steal, too heavy to move casually, too conspicuous to sell in pieces without attracting attention. A ship full of small gold coins would have been looted. A ship made of gold could only be recovered through industrial-scale engineering, which meant it could only be recovered by someone with resources and legitimacy and patience. The ship was not hidden from the Union. It was hidden from small-time thieves and desperate individuals. It was protected by its own weight. Sound of barge engines idling, water moving around hull. The metallurgists discover something unexpected in the paddle wheel axles during their structural analysis. The axles are hollow, designed as storage tubes rather than solid shafts, and inside each axle are sealed glass vials containing handwritten letters and financial records. The letters are addressed to specific individuals, banking partners and family members and business associates, written by the consortium members in April 1863, when they understood that communication networks were about to collapse entirely. The letters contain instructions for asset recovery, codes for identifying legitimate claimants, warnings about political realities and military outcomes. One letter, written by a cotton factor named Marcus Belmont, describes the decision to build the ship as an act of faith in metal rather than men, in weight rather than promises. Another letter, written by someone who signed only with the initial K, presumably Klaus Hoffmann, includes technical drawings of the hull structure and precise coordinates for the sinking location, rendered obsolete by river channel changes but still recognizable to anyone who understood how the Mississippi migrates over geological time. The letters are stained with ink that has partially dissolved but remain legible, small windows into the thought processes of people who believed their world was ending, but hoped their wealth might survive into whatever came next. The legal resolution takes 4 years and involves intervention from the Supreme Court, which rules that the gold belongs to the federal government under the principle that Confederate assets were forfeited upon surrender in 1865, but that the salvage company is entitled to compensation equaling 38% of the assessed value for recovery costs and industry standard finder's fees. The state of Mississippi receives a payment of $120 million for resource extraction from state waters. The descendants of the banking consortium receive nothing, their claims dismissed on the grounds that the original owners deliberately concealed the assets with intent to avoid lawful seizure, which nullifies any property rights that might have persisted through inheritance. The gold is melted and recast into standardized bars marked with the seal of the United States Treasury, erasing its Confederate identity and converting history into fungible commodity. 12 ingots are preserved intact and distributed to museums in Washington, Vicksburg, and New Orleans as artifacts representing the last desperate gamble of an economy that chose to build a ship from its own currency rather than admit the currency had become worthless. 4 seconds of absolute silence, museum gallery, footsteps on polished floor. The Aurelia herself is too massive to preserve intact. The hull is disassembled over 16 months in a New Orleans shipyard, each section weighed and documented and cut into manageable pieces. The paddle wheels are preserved and installed as monuments at Vicksburg National Military Park, positioned overlooking the river they once traveled. The German purity marks are left visible, stamped metal testifying to craftsmanship performed under pressure in a city that would fall to Union forces 4 months after the casting was completed. The engineering drawings and recovery records are published in maritime archaeology journals, studied by students who need to understand that material science and financial panic can combine to produce structures that should not logically exist, but do exist, because desperation erases the boundary between practical and impossible. The story becomes a case study in crisis engineering, in the things people build when they understand that symbolic systems are collapsing, and only physical reality will persist through the transition from one political order to another. The descendant of Klaus Hoffmann, a great-great-granddaughter living in Berlin, publishes the family journals in full, including the encrypted sections that describe not just the Aurelia, but 2 other ships allegedly commissioned by different southern banking groups, ships that may or may not exist, ships that may be waiting at the bottom of other rivers, or may have been destroyed, or may never have progressed beyond planning stages. The journals describe meetings in New Orleans waterfront hotels where German engineers presented proposals to desperate financiers, explaining how gold ships could be built using existing foundry capacity and European metalworking expertise. The journals describe Klaus Hoffmann's moral ambiguity about the project, his recognition that he was participating in something historically significant but ethically questionable, building monuments to wealth preservation, while Confederate soldiers starved in trenches at Vicksburg. He wrote in March 1863 that he felt like he was constructing tombs for ideas that should already be dead, giving physical form to beliefs that time will bury regardless of how much gold is smelted into their coffins. Sound of journal pages turning, old paper crackling. The final documented mention of the Aurelia before her rediscovery appears in a Union naval report dated June 1863, written by a lieutenant who interviewed a freed slave who claimed to have seen a ship made of yellow metal sinking into a river channel east of Vicksburg. The report includes a hand-drawn map showing the approximate location, but notes that the witness was considered unreliable because the claim seemed fantastical. The lieutenant wrote that the witness insisted the ship glowed like the sun even in muddy water, and that armed men watched from the shore as it disappeared. The report was filed with hundreds of other testimonies collected during the Vicksburg campaign, and forgotten in War Department archives until digitization projects made it searchable. The lieutenant's skepticism was reasonable. A ship made of gold violates basic assumptions about what is possible, what is economically rational, what desperate people might do when their abstract systems of value reveal themselves as agreement rather than substance. The witness was telling the truth. The lieutenant could not recognize truth because truth had become stranger than the lies he was trained to detect. Sound of river at night. Water moving in darkness, distant steamboat whistle fading into silence.